On the 27th of November, 1941, the thin air of the Ethiopian highlands, some 7,000 feet above sea level, carried the sharp report of artillery and the encroaching rattle of small arms. Fire toward the headquarters of General Guglielmo Nassi, standing in the beleaguered town of Gondar. Nassi was witnessing the final, inexorable dissolution of an empire. His garrison, which had once boasted a formidable strength of 40,000 men, had been whittled down by attrition, desertion, and combat to fewer than 20,000 effectives. The forces tightening the noose around his position were not the European regulars that fascist propaganda had prepared him to fight, but rather a diverse coalition that Italian intelligence had dangerously underestimated. Climbing the precipitous mountain passes, cutting through barbed wire entanglements under the sweep of machine gun fire, were African soldiers from Kenya, Uganda, and Tanganyika, supported by West African artillery units and Ethiopian irregulars. These were the men of the King's African Rifles and the Royal West African Frontier Force, troops dismissed by Rome as second-rate colonial auxiliaries incapable of complex mountain warfare. Yet they were now methodically dismantling the last stronghold of Italy's presence in East Africa. By the middle of the afternoon, the situation had become untenable. Nassi dispatched his final communique to Rome, reporting that enemy armored vehicles had breached the town and his reserve brigade had failed to stem the tide, marking the moment when Italy's East African Empire, a territory of nearly 1 million square kilometers, ruling over 5 million subjects, ceased to exist. To understand the magnitude of this collapse, one must look back to June 1940, when Benito Mussolini's position in the region appeared unassailable to military observers. The Italian Empire in East Africa was a vast, contiguous bloc comprising Ethiopia, which had been seized in 1935 through a brutal campaign involving chemical weapons. Alongside the older colonies of Eritrea and Italian Somaliland, the sheer numerical weight of the Italian presence was imposing. Nearly 300,000 troops garrisoned these territories. This force consisted of approximately 91,000 Italian metropolitan soldiers, recruited directly from Italy, and over 200,000 colonial troops, known as askari, recruited locally from Eritrea and Somalia. In terms of material, the Regia Aeronautica maintained 325 aircraft in the theater, while their armored divisions fielded 244 tanks and armored cars. In stark contrast, the British forces stationed in the neighboring territories of Sudan, Kenya, and British Somaliland were incredibly sparse, numbering roughly 19,000 men scattered across thousands of miles of frontier. The strategic assessment in Rome was that the Royal Navy, preoccupied with the Mediterranean fleet, could not force the Red Sea, leaving the Italian position impregnable. The Viceroy of Italian East Africa, General Amadeo, Duke of Este, commanded from Addis Ababa and was supported by experienced officers like General Nassi in the north and General Pietro Gazzera in the south, men who were veterans of the Great War and seasoned in colonial policing. However, the perceived impregnability of the Italian position masked a fatal logistical fragility. The empire was effectively besieged from the start, with British forces holding the territories to the west and south, and although the Red Sea was contested, Italian naval resupply was perilous and insufficient to sustain a force of 300,000 indefinitely. The Duke of Este was acutely aware that his strategic survival depended on X's victories in North Africa, forcing a negotiated peace before his supplies ran out. He banked on the defensive advantages of the terrain, believing that the rugged, mountainous topography of Ethiopia would require the British to commit massive resources to an offensive resources he believed they did not possess. What the Italian command failed to anticipate was the caliber and resilience of the forces the British Empire would eventually deploy. The counteroffensive would not be led by British regular battalions, which were desperately needed for the defense of the home islands and the war in North Africa, nor primarily by Indian Army divisions, though they played a crucial role. Instead, the vanguard of the British effort would be African soldiers, recruited, trained, and organized in East and West Africa into formations that possessed a mobility and tactical proficiency that completely upset Italian calculations. The expansion of the British colonial forces was rapid and impressive. The King's African Rifles Corps grew from a establishment of a mere 2,821 African soldiers in 1938 to a force exceeding 20,000 by March 1940. Alongside them stood the Royal West African Frontier Force, drawing manpower from Nigeria, the Gold Coast, now Ghana, Sierra Leone, and the Gambia. These were not merely garrison troops handed rifles and pushed toward the front. They were highly trained infantry formations supported by their own artillery, signals, engineers, and medical units. A typical Corps battalion consisted of approximately 1,050 African soldiers, commanded by around 36 British officers, a ratio of roughly 1 officer to every 30 men. The training regimen was rigorous, mirroring British regular army standards in weapon handling, fieldcraft, and battle drills. Crucially, the motivation of these soldiers differed fundamentally from their opponents. The men of the Corps were volunteers serving for pay and prestige, often coming from martial traditions, whereas the Italian Ascari were frequently conscripts. The relationship between the British officers and their African subordinates, characterized by the officers learning local languages like Swahili and leading from the front, fostered a unit cohesion that the Italians, who often treated their colonial troops with disdain and subjected them to erratic pay, failed to replicate. The initial phase of the conflict saw the Italians seize the initiative, capturing British Somaliland in August 1940 and pushing into border regions of Sudan and Kenya. Yet, the Duke of Este made a critical strategic error by choosing to consolidate his gains rather than exploiting the British weakness to push deeper. This pause granted Britain the breathing room necessary to assemble a coordinated counteroffensive from Sudan in the north and Kenya in the south. When the British offensive began in January 1941, under the commands of Lieutenant Generals William Platt and Alan Cunningham, the speed of the advance was shocking. Cunningham's southern thrust, spearheaded by the 11th and 12th African Divisions alongside South African units, covered ground at a rate that defied logistical models. Nigerian battalions of the Royal West African Frontier Force, for instance, traversed 100 miles of difficult terrain in a mere 3 days. At the Juba River, where Italian commanders had anticipated a pause for artillery preparation, Nigerian troops launched an immediate, aggressive assault, crossing the water under fire and storming the defensive works before the Italians could reorganize. This relentless tempo prevented the Italian commanders from utilizing their prepared phased withdrawal plans. They were constantly being outflanked and overrun before they could dig in. The campaign was not without its moments of fierce Italian resistance, most notably at Coron in Eritrea between February and March 1941. Here, Italian forces under General Michelangelo Carnimio held mountain positions that were geographically formidable. The 4th and 5th Indian Divisions threw themselves against these heights, suffering heavy casualties in a battle of attrition. British official histories later paid tribute to the defenders at Coron, noting that the Savoy Grenadiers and colonial troops fought with valor and resolution. However, the eventual collapse of Karen shattered the northern defensive line, opening the road to Asmara and Massawa. Meanwhile, in the south, the psychological impact of the relentless African advance was taking its toll. At the Marta Pass, Nigerian soldiers scaled mountainsides that Italian intelligence had deemed impassable, and at Babel, they advanced across open plains under heavy fire, using machetes to hack through barbed wire when explosives failed. The cumulative effect of these actions was the rapid disintegration of Italian morale. Addis Ababa fell on the 6th of April 1941, forcing the Duke of Este to retreat to the mountain fortress of Amba Alogi with 7,000 Italian and 3,000 colonial troops. The siege of Amba Alogi was a brutal affair, documented in the Duke's own diary, which reveals the psychological strain of constant bombardment. Surrounded by British and Commonwealth forces, and subjected to daily aerial attacks by the Royal Air Force and artillery barrages, the Duke's position became hopeless. On the 19th of May, he surrendered with full military honors. Yet, contrary to simplified historical narratives that compressed the campaign into 6 months, the war in East Africa did not end there. 2 major Italian garrisons remained defiant: General Gazzera in the southwest and General Nasi at Gondar in the northwest. While Gazzera surrendered in July, General Nasi, arguably the most competent Italian commander in the theater, prepared for a prolonged stand at Gondar. The geography favored him immensely. Gondar is situated in the high mountains, accessible only via steep, winding passes that climb 4,000 foot. Nasi had fortified these approaches, stockpiling food and ammunition, and positioning his artillery to dominate the narrow defiles. He commanded the last remnants of the empire, determined to hold out until 1942. The task of reducing Gondar fell to the 12th African Division under Major General Charles Christopher Fawkes. His force was predominantly African, comprising the 25th East African Infantry Brigade Kenyan, Ugandan, and Tanganyikan battalions of the CAR and the 26th East African Infantry Brigade, supported by the 51st Gold Coast Medium Battery and Ethiopian irregulars. The logistical challenge was immense. Attacking uphill against prepared positions required the movement of supplies over roads that had been destroyed or mined. The division utilized hundreds of mules and donkeys to transport water and ammunition up the precipitous slopes. The siege began in earnest in May 1941, but it was a slow, grinding process. Nasi's force, initially 40,000 strong, began to suffer from the same ailment that had plagued the rest of the Italian army: the desertion of colonial troops. As pay ceased and food dwindled, the Ascari melted away, leaving Nasi with approximately 7,000 Italian nationals and 12,000 remaining colonial auxiliaries by September. Despite this, he held the critical passes of Walchafit and Kolkabar, without which Gondar could not be taken. The battle for the Walchafit Pass in September demonstrated the tactical proficiency of the King's African Rifles. The 2nd, 4th, and 3rd, 4th CAR battalions undertook a grueling night climb to reach their assault positions. At dawn, they launched their attack into the teeth of Italian artillery and machine gun fire. utilizing the terrain for cover and advancing in short rushes tactics drilled into them by their British officers. They fought their way up the escarpment over 3 days of continuous combat. The victory at Wolchefit resulted in the surrender of Colonel Gondar and nearly 3,000 prisoners, at the cost of 200 car casualties. Following this, the focus shifted to the Kolkabur Pass, the final obstacle. The assault here, launched on the 20th of November, was supported by the heavy guns of the Gold Coast Battery. The fighting was desperate, often hand-to-hand, with African soldiers clearing trenches with bayonets and grenades. It was during this engagement that the Regia Aeronautica flew its final sortie of the campaign, a lone Fiat CR-42 biplane British artillery positions, killing the Royal Artillery Commander, Lieutenant Colonel Ormsby, before the pilot landed at Gondar and joined the infantry defense, a futile gesture of defiance and a lost cause. The final assault on Gondar commenced at 5:30 on the 27th of November, 1941. The plan involved a multi-pronged attack designed to overwhelm the shrinking Italian perimeter. The 26th East African Brigade attacked from the east, while the 25th attacked from the south. The terrain was so rugged that the Kenya Armored Car Regiment, equipped with Marmon Harrington armored cars, had to wait for the infantry to clear a path before they could exploit the breakthrough. By midday, the airfield at Azozo on the outskirts of the town had been secured by the 2nd 3rd Car. As the afternoon wore on, the fighting moved into the town itself, devolving into house-to-house combat. An attempted Italian counterattack from their barracks was shattered by West African artillery fire. When the armored cars finally broke into the town center at 3 p.m., the Italian resistance collapsed. General Nassi's final message to Rome acknowledged the reality that his reserves were spent and enemy armor was in the streets. With his surrender, the British took another 22,000 prisoners, bringing the total Italian and colonial losses for the campaign to over 230,000 captured, alongside massive quantities of war material, including 325 aircraft and hundreds of tanks and artillery pieces. The victory at Gondar was the culmination of a campaign that fundamentally challenged the racial hierarchies underpinning colonial rule. A British brigadier, writing to General Cunningham, felt compelled to document the performance of the Nigerian troops to counter the general's known skepticism regarding African soldiers. His letter detailed how these men had endured thirst, freezing nights at high altitude, and heavy shelling with quiet, cheerful determination, concluding simply, "He is magnificent." This sentiment was echoed by the Italian prisoners themselves, who expressed a deep demoralization and a sense of betrayal by their own leadership. The contrast in morale was decisive. While the Car and West African units maintained cohesion through the fiercest fighting, the Italian colonial system, built on coercion and poor treatment, fractured under stress. The battle honors awarded to the King's African Rifles Gondar, Kolkabur, Amba Halagi were earned in the hardest crucible of war. The strategic implications of this victory were profound, if often overlooked in the broader history of the Second World War. The elimination of the Axis threat in East Africa allowed President Roosevelt to declare the Red Sea a non-combat zone, opening a vital supply lifeline to Egypt that would prove critical for the battles of El Alamein. Furthermore, it freed up British Commonwealth forces to be redeployed to the Far East and North Africa. But perhaps the most lasting legacy was the transformation of the soldiers themselves. Men who had left their villages in Kenya, Uganda, Nigeria returned, as veterans who had defeated a European power. The myth of European invincibility had been shattered on the slopes of Kolkabur and the streets of Gondar. These veterans would go on to form the core of the independence movements that would sweep the continent in the subsequent decades. The fall of Gondar, on that November afternoon in 1941, was not just the end of Mussolini's East African Empire. It was a harbinger of the end of the colonial era in Africa itself. The discrepancy in casualty figures tells a stark story of military efficiency and morale. The entire East African campaign cost the Commonwealth forces approximately 5,000 killed, wounded, and missing, a remarkably low figure given the scale of the theater and the number of enemy troops. In contrast, the Italian loss of nearly 250,000 men as prisoners, alongside significant battle casualties, highlighted the utter collapse of their command and control. The 70,000 Commonwealth troops, the vast majority of whom were Africans, had achieved what was arguably the most lopsided Allied victory of the early war years. While the global focus shifted almost immediately to the Pacific, following the attack on Pearl Harbor just 10 days after Nassi's surrender, the significance of what occurred in the Ethiopian highlands remained etched in the history of the regiments that fought there. The Italian commanders, from the Duke of Este to General Nassi, were forced to confront the reality that their racial theories were bankrupt. They had been defeated not by overwhelming material superiority, but by African light infantry who outmarched, outmaneuvered, and outfought them in terrain that should have favored the defense. The reports they wrote, and the diaries they kept, stand as a testament to this realization. The East African campaign was a war of movement, logistics, and endurance. fought in some of the most inhospitable terrain on earth, and it was won by the discipline and courage of the African soldier. From the crossing of the Juba River to the final storming of the heights at Gondar, the King's African Rifles and the Royal West African Frontier Force proved themselves to be elite formations. As the sun set on Gondar on November 27, 1941, set on the short-lived imperial dreams of fascist Italy, dismantled by the very people it had sought to subjugate,